We now have, and we'll have actually a few extra minutes because Brian actually finished a little ahead of schedule for us. The first of three, actually there will be four, I misspoke, and there are actually two this afternoon. Special symposia that are organized around a particular theme, where I will step aside as the introducer because we will have a symposium chair, and in most cases the chair was also the organizer of the symposium. And so we will have multiple speakers with short speeches within the time frame available to us during these special symposia. The first for this afternoon is the Art and Science of Forecasting in the Age of Global Warming. That was my title. I'm not sure if all of the speakers who are going to be speaking today are comfortable even with the title, and I'm sure they aren't going to be addressing that in depth. They may allude to that as one dimension of the problem of forecasting in contemporary society. The organizer of this panel, however, is Harold Linstone, a former president of the ISSS and longtime member. He was the founder and is professor emeritus of the Portland State University System Science program, and his for more than 30 years has been the editor of the journal Technological Forecasting and Social Change. So here is one of the world's authorities with some of his board members to back him up on the subject of the art and science of forecasting. And so I'd like to turn this over to Hal, and he will introduce the individual speakers.
Thank you very much. When Peter asked me to take on this session, I found myself very lucky to be able to corral three people who I have great respect for. We've known each other a long time. To soothe Peter's concerns, we will be talking about the future of forecasting. And I'll briefly just introduce them now, and then each of us will talk for 15-20 minutes, and then there will be the break. After the break, we will have questions from the audience. We'll have discussions among ourselves, and that'll be in the other venue, the room A60, after the break. So if you hold your questions till then, I think we can get at least all the main statements on the table right now. After myself, we'll be talking Joe Coates. Could you just raise your hand, Joe? Joe is president of the Coates and Jarratt Incorporated, and it is a 21-year business in it's considered the most diversified futures research firm in the United States. And before that, he worked for the Office of Technology Assessment, and he initiated studies at the National Science Foundation in this area, so he has a long experience. The second speaker after me is Professor Don Kash. Don is in the front row here. He's a Hazel Professor of Public Policy at George Mason University and has been doing research in the area of technology policy for 40 years. And he has last year published a book with Bob Rycraft, which is, I found extremely interesting, called The Complexity Challenge: Technological Innovation for the 21st Century. And then we have Alan Porter, who is a professor of industrial. Here he is, right here, professor of industrial and systems engineering and public policy at Georgia Tech. And he also has been long associated with forecasting and technology assessment. They're developing normative forecasts on the future of technology foresight for the coming 20 years. And he will talk to us about the dramatic changes in the kind of forecasting that is now coming into play. So I'm going to first discuss. I'm going to go down to the projector. Let's see. I need the portable. Is there a portable? Now? Technology. Okay, I'm going to try to put the subject of technological forecasting, although we won't restrict ourselves to that, in context. I might say, just by way of explanation how I got into the whole business, is I spent the first 20 years of my career in industry, the aerospace industry, and that's where we saw the need for planning, and forecasting was simply part of the planning process. We had to know where our clients were likely to go in the next, not just 5 years, but we had, because of the long lead time of systems, we had to look further ahead. Now, if you consider the historical period, you know that beginning with the Depression, it's very interesting. When you talk about innovations, they don't come in a nice, steady progression. They tend to cluster. And they cluster, interestingly enough, kind of towards the end of depressions. And if you consider the quadratic of cycles, you have 50 to 60-year cycle. You had the 1930 depression, 1930 on. And we find, for example, if you take some of the key major innovations, computers, television, radar, nuclear power, jets, all got going in about a 15-year period starting in 1930. And you know, the obvious question is, why do they tend to cluster that way? Well, what happens is you have, we tend to look at the Kondratiev long wave as a period of an upturn and a downturn. And it's in the upturn, you have the knowledge consolidation. You exploit what you know, and you have it's a fairly stable period. But you get to a point where you see you have a point of diminishing returns, and you get to a peak and start the downhill phase. That's the problem. That's the situation that Schumpeter called creative destruction. When you find that the old ideas don't work so well anymore, some of the most creative people are able finally to bring their ideas into play, because during the upturn, there was no need for them. I mean, you could exploit what you had already, what you're doing, what you found profitable, and what you were good at, and so you weren't likely to take major risks. But when things are going downhill, you get to the bottom, you're willing to do anything. You're willing to take risks. And so that's when the point when the creative people have their best chance. So then you had this period here, and you got to the Cold War, the World War II, and you got to a stable growth period. And that's when the quantitative technological forecasting methods really developed. When the Air Force was the prime client of the aerospace industry, was very anxious to develop methodology and techniques, because they had to look 10, 15, 20 years ahead. And some of these huge systems that were developing required that. So that's when you had a kind of a growth period in the methodology, particularly quantitative exploratory forecasting extrapolative methods. And that reached its peak about 1965 to 70. Here you see this process. And you see here, this is basically when planning was in favor. The Air Force, the RAND Corporation, forecasting methods were developed, and then they were codified. You had books by Erich Jansch, OECD 1967, Bright, and other people, Martino and so on. And our journal that Peter mentioned was formed in 1970. But interestingly enough, that was followed then by a less, in terms of methodology, less creative period. In fact, that applied to much of the planning process altogether. Let me just show you the kind of headlines magazines showed. Corporate strategists under fire. Forecasters flunk. New breed of strategic planner. Number crunching professionals are giving way to line managers. Goodbye corporate staff. These were the headlines that followed, and the impact on the forecasting methodology was clear. There weren't any more the new quantitative methods coming out. But that creative, you might say, this creative destruction period here also applied, in my view at least, to the methodology, because it meant you had the seeds being created of where to go next. And multiple perspectives is one. Complexity science has some ideas which are very relevant, and new methods are kind of slowly taking form. Some of them are not yet very clear, but these are the inclinations. So here is what you see another cluster of innovations. The internet, communication satellite, optical fiber, the genome. You have another concentration here, and it wouldn't be surprising at all if we get another new wave of methodology innovations. Just to an interesting point here, if you take in terms of the global spread of all of this, if you take the technological innovators defined by countries that have 10 patents or more per million population, these are the ones listed here. And in terms of contributions to our literature, our journal, they rank as shown here. And this is contributors, authors, and this is subscribers. And what's underlined here are special issues that are edited by people in those countries. So you can see the spread of that. But also you notice that a very important contributor is India, which is not in this category here, but is defined as a technological adopter. But that is defined in turn as high-tech exports, at least 2% of the gross domestic product. Thailand is also on this list. And then, of course, are the technologically excluded, which have made very few contributions. So let me just then put on here the methods that we can go into more detail later on, but just to indicate, these were on the initial upwave, the exploratory models, growth models, S-curve or logistic curves or Pearl curves, normative methods, morphological, needs analyses. I did first 1959-60 in our corporation, relevance trees, and general systems analysis, system dynamics modeling. And then you have others which are mixed, exploratory and normative. Exploratory, looking for the past or the future. Normative, looking at the future need and then seeing how, going from the present, you can get there. And usually the forecast has to, whether it starts with one or the other, it has to have an interaction between these. And here are some of the new things that are coming. Multiple perspectives. We had a workshop on this yesterday afternoon. You have information technology-based techniques, and I expect Alan Porter will talk more about this. Complexity science-based techniques. We're learning, for example, the fact that the beginning and end of an S-shaped curve, the typical growth curve with a limit, asymptotic, has a chaotic period at the beginning and at the end. The data shows this to be the case, but something we're much more conscious of now. I would say the most important, in a sense a negative, but a very important insight that's been provided by all the work, starting with the Santa Fe Institute on complexity science, is the limits of forecasting, the inherent limits, that going from one S-shaped curve across a chaotic bridge to the next growth curve, that it's very difficult to forecast from one curve to the other curve. Once you have, we long ago knew that once you have on a new technology, let's say 5 or 10% grow, achieved 5% or 10% of the market, you can then extrapolate very well up to 90%. But the point is, how do you determine the takeoff point? It's like with typewriters. You had lots of versions of typewriters, but how do you pick the Remington? Same with bicycles. You had all these different versions. How do you know? That's always been the point, and now we can put that into context in terms of the complex adaptive systems. One of the interesting things new here is this. Now, this is an acronym. I can't give you what it stands for, except to say it's a Russian acronym. What was very interesting is that after the end of, beginning about 1946, Genrikh Altshuler in Russia, or Soviet Union at the time, looked at globally at all the patents and tried to come up with some rules as to what the innovative characteristics were, what did the patents depend on, what did they involve. And as a result, he looked at then a subset in more detail, and out of that work, which was not at all known in the West, wasn't really translated until fairly recently, he came up with a kind of a normative forecast, which is proving very practical for particularly in engineering, as to how to solve a problem when you have conflicts. For example, weight versus strength in a material and so on, and how to be creative in that. So it's proving very useful. It's a kind of a morphological approach. Scenario management, the Germans. Here we have Russians. Here we have Germans. Scenario management has been done some very excellent work recently at the Nixdorf Institute in Paderborn, Germany. And we've had an article on it in our journal. There's a book in German out on it. And it applies directly to making scenarios, taking all the environmental conditions very significant into account, doing cluster analysis and coming up with then ways that a company can either come up with a best strategy or a robust strategy, which might be good under a whole variety of external conditions, under alternative scenarios. The multiple perspectives have proven useful. In fact, the first National Science Foundation grant I got was to apply that concept to technology assessment. That were done, technology assessments, 3 technology assessments done for the National Science Foundation. Because you see, once you get beyond the forecasting, and what's becoming more and more important is the impact of a technology on the society. In information technology, this is obvious, but it's true in almost every situation. So that it becomes important to look at other aspects than strictly the technology. And that involves human aspect, and therefore, again, the multiple perspectives come into play. What Don Kash will probably, I'm sure, will discuss is the co-evolution of technological and organizational networks, which characterize all important innovations these days, very much unlike the Thomas Alva Edison inventor type of innovation. His book on complexity, Challenge of Complexity, is all about that. That also then involves organization, not just technology, and organizational perspectives. And finally, if you look at it, you also recognize the importance of individuals who are key in getting an innovation on track, so to speak. here is a list of examples. Where you see the key individuals that sold the ideas to non-technological people, and here's the areas: atomic energy, the Apollo program, and so on, that were instrumental in pushing something forward. So the individual is also important, not just the technology by itself, the organization, as well as individuals make an enormous difference. I mentioned the complexity science. Stu Kaufman has suggested in his book, the one about the universe, what's the name of it? At Home in the Universe, thank you. Has suggested the analogy between biological evolution and technological evolution. And that, just as in biology you get niches formed and creating their own evolution, then you have the same kind of thing happening in technology. I mean, have certain, when you had the car, you needed gas stations as well as oil companies and so forth. You had a whole highways and so forth. So a lot of other things get involved. So let me just now very briefly just list, and we can, because these are, what I want to list now is just the areas of substance that obviously need to be addressed by the new methodology, and then we'll have the other speakers. And these are all pretty well known, and of course there'll be ones that are not yet so obvious. Much of it is information related, including genetics, brain technology, and so on. A lot of this is, we're in a sense in a technological upheaval or chaos state. There's a lot of things that are brewing, and in materials technology, nanotechnology, and customizing products to their, and getting the designing materials so that they have certain desired characteristics, strength, and so forth, as well as new energy technologies. And then you can get more farther out, and you look at such things as molecular manufacturing, or manufacturing at the molecular level, and possibly with virtual reality and cyberspace, creating artificial realities, and then the convergence of these, overcoming human physical and psychological limitations, blurring the boundary between fact and fiction, and these kind of things, are on the horizon. So this suggests at least one example of an agenda, or we will get additional. Each speaker, I'm sure, will have his own items to add to this. A fundamental problem that's always been around since I've been working is the discounting. Economists, of course, use that in a standard way, but we discount the future and the past. We focus on the recent past and on the near-term future, and that has been this problem. And surprisingly, it's interesting how little our telecommunications have been used to overcome that. You had in 1936, I think it was Orson Welles with the War of the Worlds radio broadcast, which was a vivid way to display an alternative scenario, but relatively little has been done. Recognize the inherent limits I mentioned in forecasting, and develop crisis management. That's always an alternative. You will always have unknowables and unknowns, and you will always have industrial catastrophe, for example. The more energy the world needs, the more that's likely. There's no way to completely eliminate them. You can reduce the risks, but you can never eliminate them. And we find in my analysis, for example, all of the major disasters, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, the Bhopal accident, all have basically similar characteristics. It's a combination of, let's say, half a dozen events that occurred, each low probability. But the combination, which is even lower probability, nevertheless, these things happen. And it's never just one thing. But we can go into that later also. But crisis management techniques like, for example, creating high reliability organizations is one way to address that. Learning to understand and use stability chaos domains to delay, because sometimes you know that management cannot accept change at the speed it comes. I mean, you may want to cut feedback loops. On the other hand, you may, as every executive, effective executive knows, if an organization gets too set in its ways, it becomes static, it becomes routine, and you don't innovate anymore. So what do? You shake up the organizations. You create chaos artificially. So that's sometimes you want to kick in a chaotic regime. Examine the role of information technology in the self-organization and emergence of the global society. Talking about new governance, which I don't mean new government, I mean new governance. I don't mean a global government. But we already see how, for example, the individuals, the customers of Nike can be effective by essentially changing labor policy in Malaysia, where the Nike has a plant, by the concerns about child labor and so forth. So there are all kinds of ways to exert, have an impact. Develop qualitative forecasting tools as in biotechnology. That's already being done by some of the drug companies to come up by, all permutation combinations genetically to come up with new ways to treat diseases. Develop the analogy between biological and technological evolution in terms of niche creation and diversity. That's what Kaufman, I mentioned, was talking about. And focus on technological organizational co-evolution networks. That's what Don Kash talks about. So here are just some of the items, and I'll vacate the spot now and turn it over to Joe.
So may not hear from it, but it'll work. I want to talk about a half dozen new kinds of tools for forecasting, and before I do that, I have to talk about the question of why bother. What's the need for forecasting improvement? And it basically comes out of the fact that contemporary forecasting has its origins in the Rand Corporation, Stanford Research Institute, the Hudson Institute, and so on. But modern forecasting has its origins only 200 years ago with the Marquis de Condorcet, who died in the French Revolution. Condorcet discovered such interesting things as trickle-down as a way to understand the future. He also noted the importance of expert opinion, which is something we might want to challenge today. And he came up with a wide range of his own forecasts, which over the subsequent 200 years have been pretty well validated. So we're talking about an enterprise in which forecasting and the look to the future is essentially a Western activity. It basically, in the contemporary version, comes out of military and aerospace and related high-tech concerns, where the people working at this were engineers or engineers converted into futurists. And of course, the whole area has been time-bound, largely focusing on the short term, because institutions are basically only interested in the short term. 50 years out is a very, very long time for almost any public or private institution. So by being culture-bound, by being professionally disciplinary-bound, and by being culture-bound, that suggests the reasons why we need some substantial expansion in the kinds of factors that enter into our forecasting. So let me develop the background, the need a little bit further, and then we'll see what the possibilities are for new techniques. Of course, complementing those three bounded elements is the fact that we are at the opening end of the cornucopia of new benefits being delivered to society in a variety of different technological ways. We also have new concerns, such as matters of new diseases, new social pressures, the scale of the human enterprise. Those have never been seriously considered before in forecasting. We have automated and robotic devices. We have the unprecedented implications of genetics, making us, for the first time, a species which can directly influence its own evolution. Then there's the global scale enterprises, the possibility and surely the imminence of weather modification, of concerns about the ocean, of the perhaps interventions to prevent the melting of the Arctic and later the Antarctic ice caps. So new concerns continually raise the need to look at old things in new ways. Another factor is that current tools don't necessarily fit the social or the cultural context in which decisions now have to be made. And that becomes an extremely important factor to consider, to have tools that are much more appropriate for institutions and for cultures. Another factor linking to that is the new uses of future studies will change as democracy spreads, as constituencies grow, as people become more diversified among those who have influence on change. Democracy just brings more and more people into the game of monitoring, orchestrating, and demanding and controlling change. And so what we have is a growing need for methods and techniques that are more transparent, so that ordinary people, whatever ordinary may mean to you, so that ordinary people can understand what the technique was that was used, feel that it's so legitimate and understandable, no mystery black boxes, that they themselves could execute it, and then finally, that if they did exercise that technique themselves, they would come up with similar results. So that kind of transparency is going to be very difficult to achieve, since so much of this has come out of engineering, who are not in any way intimidated by black boxes, in fact kind of revel in them. That's their great secret. The blacker you can make them, the better off they are. So we need tools that not only satisfy transparency for people in general, but then we need the kinds of tools that will affect people in particular groups, social classes, economic classes, people of different backgrounds. In the U.S., for example, various kinds of immigrants, various kinds of old country people, various kinds of long-lived people here. Another factor shaping the need for new forecasting tools is the working across cultural boundaries. As the world comes together, new problems arise which really have a powerful futures element, and we simply don't know how to deal with them. For example, in the Middle East, we're developing and continue to develop very elaborate waterworks, some of which will cross national boundaries, some of which put whole countries, hundreds of thousands to tens of millions of people, in a uniquely vulnerable position from some radical military activity, from a dissident group, from terrorists or whatever. How do we make real to those people who have never thought about these kinds of downstream, derivative, secondary consequences of what they might do? How do we make real to them what those consequences are without necessarily putting a finer edge on their mischief? What else is coming along? I think that we have need for new concepts and new tools because there's urgency associated with some issues, and we just don't know how to impart to a lax, laid-back, supine population like that of the U.S. and Canada, like that of Western Europe, like that of India, like that of Japan, like that of, you name, 180 other countries. We don't know how to instill a sense of urgency in either the population or in the political apparatus. Look what's happened to Black Africa. Black Africa is in a disaster that was not only fully forecastable, but was forecast. We have more people in Black Africa by a factor of several than in all the rest of the world suffering from AIDS. Everyone watched, everyone listened, and no one gave a damn. How do we make that more real to people? Similarly, today we're confronted with a very interesting issue of greenhouse warming. We can find very intelligent, reasonable people who will deny its reality, or that it's confirmed, or it's only 25% anthropogenic, or let's wait a while. But how do you figure out to respond to a situation in which the maturation of the problem is almost coincident with the development of the knowledge that the problem is real? At what point can you anticipate that you need to take action where you don't have full, absolute confirmation down to a gnat's eyelash? So we're confronted with this question of how do you get across a sense of urgency in a laid-back world in which each of you is, in my judgment, an active participant in that oxymoronic business of being laid back. The full range of the human sensorium has never been engaged in futures work. Futures work is essentially cerebral, through the eye, through the ear, you think about it, and so on. But I know of no significant futures work that's kinesthetic, tactile, involves olfactory capabilities, involves gustatory capabilities, involves our proprioception. You know, my finger is pointing to the top of my head. How do I know that? Proprioception is the sense that tells me that. So we've barely begun to explore the sensorium as a way of making the future more real. And then there's the matter of differences. We hear so much about them in terms of gender, ethnicity, group membership, age, and so forth and so on. What do you have to tailor to deal with a 70-year-old, or deal with a 25-year-old, or deal with a woman, or deal with a transsexual, or deal with a male, or deal with somebody who's a banker, or deal with somebody who is ... What are the special hooks you need to get into the minds of those people to tell them something when the very concerns that are most important to them, their group concerns, wall them off from receiving ideas very openly and very favorably? There's also, as Hal has mentioned, his own innovative creation, the tendency to discount the future. Just like interest in reverse, the disaster that's 10 years in the future is less important than the one that occurred 5 years ago, and far, far less important than the one that occurred the day before yesterday. So the larger the disaster and the farther in the future it is, the more it's likely to be discounted. And so, for example, no one has paid any really intelligent attention to the situation in San Francisco or in Los Angeles, or even most interesting of all, in St. Louis, from earthquakes that are sure to happen. So those are some of the things that raise issues that we need to be concerned with. There are a bunch of other things that one might want to consider. Let me just suggest a couple of them. Hal mentioned the notion of normative, that is goal-oriented forecasting. We want to fill in the dots. How do you develop new tools and techniques for making that clearer? It isn't just a matter of flights to the moon, it isn't just a matter of nuclear submarines, but look at the goof that we've just committed in the last 3 years with this workfare program. Workfare, or the problems of structurally impoverished women and men to a lesser extent, people locked in poverty, the thought was get them to work and they'll be better off, the society will be better off, let's run a great social experiment. Well, the social experiment elements of that wasn't worth car fare from here to the next corner. There was no experiment, there was no intelligence, there was no anticipation of consequences. There was no acknowledgement that 15% of these people would be, after the best of efforts, absolutely unemployable. Now, how do you forecast to the dimwits in legislatures and the dimmer dimwits in the state houses and in the White House that those things are not experiments, they don't represent the future, and they haven't given 5 cents worth of attention to what the consequences are of their acts? How do you introduce the future and forecasting into those normative situations? There are others that we can talk about, but let me go on and suggest some of the techniques. I think that film is a marvelous high potential for being important to looking at the future. Unfortunately, film is now contaminated, intellectually polluted, and a future's disgrace in terms of the kind of trash that comes out in Star Trek, Star Wars, all the things about the boys from Brazil, the stuff about Los Angeles 50 years from now or 25 years from now, and so on. Science fiction dominates films, and yet that science fiction has to have an adverse effect on people. Otherwise, you find yourself in the incredible position of denying that the most significant educational device in the last 50 years doesn't educate, or it only educates selectively, namely movies and video. How do we introduce into that vast industry, or complement that vast industry independently, with looks at how the world can change, create the imagery for it, and deliver it to people in a way that's positive? Every one of you has experienced pain, travail, loss, illness, sickness, death, relatives, friends, accidents, and so on. It's easy for you and for everybody else to wallow in negativism and what can go wrong. Virtually every person in this room is unpracticed in thinking about a positive future. Now, how can we move to a positive future when 98% of the people in this room and 99% of the people I know are so habituated against positive thinking that they can't imagine a world which is a world different from the relief of the problems we're so familiar with, war, poverty, etc., etc. Have a positive thought and think about how exciting that could be if that positive thought involved a social plan. How do you get that positive thought away? Well, films are a great way to do it. In fact, films today, as you know, even the science fiction films, are nothing more than variations on the old Western movie, dressed up in bizarre clothing and speaking in stilted language. What else? I think cartoons and comic strips have a great potential. Look what Dilbert has done. Dilbert is a great axe wielder against corporate nonsense, against the bizarre behavior, against the hypocrisy, the incongruity that goes on in corporate and business life. Where's the Dilbert who is going to open up the future? Where's the Dilbert who is going to show us what the world could be like? Comic strips are beautiful in doing this because they hit everybody at every age, and they can come in neat, clean little bite sizes. It'd be nice if we had a cartoon strip about the year 2025. What else? Great opportunities for participatory tools. Again, the traditional participatory tools involve what has characterized much of the human interaction in forecasting. Namely, you try to pry out of experts some ideas that they have. You ask people, you interrogate them. That's the comfortable limits of participation. I would like to see participatory techniques used that were based on psychodrama, in which you and I and other people like us had to act out some future situation in which they had to carry through in a cogent way what a new capability will deliver to them, how they will use it, what it will mean, what kind of new choices they will have. So I would opt for a lot more psychodrama in our world. We know historically that contests have been extremely effective in some situations in bringing forth new inventions, new devices. Much of the world's exploration would not have been possible without contests to provide them with the food through a 3-month to a 3-year trip involving lots of technological invention. Well, I would like to see contests for plays, for movies, for novels, for essays that illuminate the future, that look at the future not as Armageddon unrolling, but look at the future in a wide range of ways in which could develop and be seen. It would be nice if there were a Pulitzer Prize and if there were a Nobel Prize for the best image of the future created this year and next year and every year thereafter. What else? I think that historians are just one big pain in the neck when it comes to looking to the future. Historians operate on a model which is so restrictive. It's wondered every one of them doesn't have a brain cramp, They optimize on getting it right rather than being useful. Have any of you ever met a useful historian? Yeah, there's always an aberrant in the room or somebody with special experience. The point is that they sacrifice getting it right for being useful socially. Now, how could historians be useful socially? One of the things we absolutely do not know is why people buy what they buy. Why do they adopt what they adopt? Why do they choose to do what they do? Now, oh, you can't say that's not true. Look at all the market research that goes on. No, that kind of market research doesn't deal with you, me, or your neighbor. It deals with statistical collections of data and with remote analysis of statistics. But exactly what made you accept or reject vaccination? What exactly made you buy those headphones that you're wearing as opposed to not buy them? I'm sorry, I thought you had on headphones. Okay. All right. What exactly makes you buy a new pair of shoes? What exactly makes you choose that you want to go from a 14 to a 27-inch television set? When historians can tell us about the details of choice in the first 2, 3, 4, 5% of the introduction of something new into the society, they will render major service to understanding the future, because that will give us the kind of models which we're totally bereft of. What else? I think that I've talked about the special groups, but this notion of needing new futures techniques is not at all a new idea. Jim Bright, who was one of the grand old men of technological forecasting back in 1970, pointed out that the hypothesis behind many of our approaches to forecasting is largely unproven. So let's get a little proof in there. And second, he points out, with rare exceptions, comprehensive and consistently based time series of data are not available to be used in forecasting. So we definitely need some improvement there. Later, another preeminent futurist, Olaf Helmer, laid down some 6 things, this is 1978, that were needed to improve forecasting, namely improving judgmental data. Who's making the judgments and what's the basis for the judgments they're making, and so on from there. Learning to do a model construction using soft or judgmental material is going to be more important, he thought, than it was at that time. And learning to develop appropriate sets of social and other indicators, a point which I've alluded to. Let me just wrap up with one last point. I think that what we need to do is introduce techniques into forecasting that deal with nonverbal, non-intellectual elements, not to dismiss those things, of course, but to complement them. We need to understand what does posture, verbal patterns, cultural patterns, photography, films, people's actions, what do they tell us about the future if we understood them better than we now do? So, thank you all very much. Did you say next slide?
Not yet. I've been trying to understand technological innovation for 10 years or so. The work began with the simple notion that the innovation of technology had become the dominant causal force in society. And it was the effort to get some insight into how technological innovation occurred that led me down the road to complexity science. So I want to start out by telling you that For my purposes, technologies are complex if you can't understand them. Now, I've gone through 22 definitions of complexity, and they all share the fact that they can't be understood. A lot of nuances in the process, but that's really the case. Next. Just want to give you a little bit of a measure of what we have found to be going on. We looked at the 30 most valuable technological exports from all countries in the world, and those 30 represent about 50% of the value of all goods exports. And this is just an indication of what has happened with regard to this standard of understanding if you look at 1970 and 1996. And next, please. And I want to just give you a little example here from my own personal experience, mostly because I like to do it. In 1970, I bought a farm in Iowa. We planted corn and soybeans with a planter that had a slotted disc in the bottom of a seed box that was hooked to a wheel through shafts and gears. And it was simple, straightforward, and I understood it. This year, we planted corn and soybeans with a planter that is controlled by a microprocessor that uses a digital database collected from the last 3 years of combining. That digital database is hooked to a GPS system, and we plant, the density of the planting reflects the quality of the soil meter by meter. That's simply a soybean field which shows each meter of production over the last 3 years, with the green being over 55 bushels per acre and the yellow being under 35 bushels per acre. We expect within about 5 years to apply chemicals and fertilizers. Now, this has happened essentially over 30 years in little increments. Complexity has been spreading through our technologies like an oil slick moving into a bay in one place or another. It's every place. It's in all technologies, and it's an expanding phenomenon. Next, please. Now, there are two things that stand out regarding the innovation of complex technologies. One is that innovation has become a routine activity. One of the most striking things about innovation today is that it's carried out by groups of people with B- performance at Utah State University, organized in one way or another, and innovation just goes on continuously. It's not dependent on geniuses. As a matter of fact, if you had to rely on geniuses for innovation, we wouldn't have nearly as much of it as we do. The second is that we don't understand how we do it. Now, understanding means you understand cause and effect. And the fact is we don't understand how we innovate. And the most striking thing about complex technologies is that they are the creations of networks of organizations with diverse kinds of capability and knowledge. And it's the ability to put them together that is key. Complexity and synthesis are Siamese twins, and they're both growing at the present time. And yet, we have organizations that know how to do it, but we haven't done any courses at MIT that tell us how to do it. There just isn't any theory out there. Next, please. Now, in an effort to try to understand this process of the innovation of complex technologies, we did several efforts at big ends, collecting data, and we couldn't get any insight. And so we decided what we'd do was to look at 6 technologies from the initial innovation of those technologies up to the present time, and try to understand how the innovation process occurred. Very normative effort, a very descriptive effort. We started out by asking people in the involved technical communities to tell us what the innovations were over that period of time, and then we tried to understand what took place. And these are the 6 case studies that we did. Now, The dominant characteristic is that all of those innovations carried out by networks of organizations and people who did not understand what they were doing. So the great management and policy question is, what do you do if you want innovation, if you want to control innovation, you can't understand it? Next, please. Now, what we found was that you could identify in these networks 3 different innovation patterns. The first pattern we characterized as the transformation pattern, and you'll notice this S curve has network on one side and technology on the other, and that's to try to get at this notion of coevolution, because every time there's an adaptation in the technology, there's an adaptation in the network. The innovation in these networks is heavily dependent upon tacit knowledge. It is heavily dependent upon routines, a number of which the people involved in the organizations don't even know they're involved in. And it's heavily dependent upon heuristics. That is, it is dependent upon things that are not explicit and don't fit within explicit cause and effect frameworks or theoretical structures. Yet, at the same time, for most of the innovations that occur in the world today, the people who are involved can both tell you what the performance characteristics of the next innovation will be, and they can tell you with absolute confidence that they will accomplish it. Can't tell you how, just that they will do it. When you ask them, well, how do you know you're going to accomplish it? They say, because we're going to work on it. Now let me take the 3 patterns for you. The first pattern, the transformation pattern, is associated with a totally new technology. And it is associated with a new organizational network. It's a first of a kind. I suppose the best widely known example today would be the internet. Something really new, something I couldn't imagine a very few years ago, and I find out that I'm not unique in that sense. The second thing that's involved is that the knowledge and capabilities which gets put into this system is acquired through a process of trial and error. Transformation is a very high-risk activity. It's chaotic, it's disorganized, it's hard to predict, and it is almost always funded by government. The fact is that the private sector is not the dominant funder of transformational innovation patterns. The second innovation pattern is the normal innovation pattern, and that's where you enhance an existing design. It's an incremental innovation. So in a case we'd all know that's the 8086, the 286, the 386, the 486, the Pentium, so on down the line. If you ask people in the semiconductor industry what comes next, what do they tell you? Moore's Law. But what turns out to be the case, if you ask people in the jet turbine blade industry what comes next, it's 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay? I mean, the fascinating thing about this is that this is easy stuff to forecast. How do you do it? We go out and ask people in the industry. They'll tell you what the next couple of increments are going to be in terms of performance, but not necessarily in how it will be accomplished. The third innovation pattern is what we call the transition pattern. Now, the transition pattern occurs when a technology runs out its string for whatever reason. The market may be saturated. You may have a new scientific technological knowledge base that allows you to change things. You may reach a point where the technological industry can no longer think of an incremental innovation that will create new markets. Remember that for most complex technologies, the markets are now structured by innovation to obsolescence cycles. I have a beautiful granddaughter. I hate cameras, but I wanted to take a picture of her, so I went to Ritz Camera, said, give me an idiot-proof camera. I want something that will take a perfect picture and requires nothing on my part. And they gave me an Olympus stylus, $110. And I said, what's the next best camera? They gave me an Icon. I said, what's the difference? They said, your camera has twice as many lens settings as the Nikon. I don't think I'd have known any difference. And I said, when was the last time you sold a Nikon? The day the Olympus came in. I said, why would anybody buy half as many lens settings and pay $5 more? Now, if you look around at the pattern of technologies, this is a common characteristic. You get up to this point, however, as we did, for example, with analog magnetic tape audio systems, and you can't think of anything that will generate new markets. And along at the same time comes digital electronics, and you get a transition. And the transition is to the audio CD, which uses light rather than electronics. But what it is a fusion of two systems. And this is the normal pattern for transition innovations. These are highly disruptive periods, but they almost always involve putting together pre-existing technological systems that were not integrated or fused in a previous period. May I have the next one? Now, what we tried to do in connection with this was to take a look as we moved from each innovation, each distinct piece of hardware, in our case, by standing on that hardware and looking out at the organizational network. And we ask ourselves, what's that network core capabilities, complementary assets, organizational learning, path dependency, and selection environment. And what I'd like to do just very quickly in this process is run you through those patterns and show you what we found. May I have the next one, please? This is the transformational pattern, and what I'm trying to do here is to say, what did the world look like before the innovation, and what did it look like after the innovation? Transformational patterns have new core capabilities. Transformational patterns commonly have some new complementary assets, that is, technological capabilities that are supportive, but lots of those are pre-existing. The organizational learning tends to be, in our language, cosmopolitan. When you're in the process of trying to do something that's not been done before, you have to look every place. And you find out how to do things frequently in areas that you would never have expected the knowledge to come from. So you've got to have very broad and initially probably pretty thin views. There is very weak path dependence. Remember, most complex technologies are like my corn planter. They are cumulative. But you don't have anything to build on when you're in these transformational patterns. And finally, the selection environment. If you want to do it in economic terms, talk about it as the market. The market usually doesn't understand enough about what the technology will do to know whether it wants it. Okay. Next one. This is the normal pattern. First, if you are a business person, this is where you want to be, because this is where you make your money. You make your money in being first or delivering in parallel with your competitors, not from having a big breakthrough. Very different than simple technologies such as pharmaceuticals, for example. Core capabilities, little add-on, not much change. Same thing is true with complementary assets. The learning is local. Now, what does that mean? That means that almost all of the incremental innovation takes place within the existing network or the surrounding technological community, and it means that you progress by throwing away knowledge. The one thing you want to do is you don't want a lot of knowledge in screwing up your progress. So the key to success is to get rid of knowledge. To put it in the terms of Gordon Moore, he says that Intel succeeds by deciding how it's going to solve a problem and doing it. If that doesn't work, they decide how they're going to solve a problem and do that. But the one thing they never do is try to understand. Understanding takes too much time, and it has no payoff. Path dependence, very strong. You build on what you have. It's the old Microsoft syndrome. And the market knows what comes next, and it's waiting for you. Final one. Next one, Joe. The transitional pattern, generally what happens is you have a merging of two networks, and you have a merging of two core capabilities into a new set of core capabilities in the network. You almost always have to add some kinds of new complementary assets. We call the learning regional. That is, you got to have a lot more than was in the existing network, but you don't look too widely. And what's happening a lot of times today in connection with this is that this really involves all of the competitors getting together and agreeing upon a set of criteria for the design. Path dependence is medium, and the selection environment or the market is moderate. People have some notion of what's going to sell, but not precisely. If you want an example of this phenomenon today, take a look at what is happening as we're trying to move from the audio CD to the DVD or the super audio CD, whatever the case may be. That's the end of it. Thanks. Time's up. Yep.
Looking for the computer?
Computer. Oh, computer. Spot on.
Certainly
Is that
enough
too
to
bright
see.
for you?
No. Where's
Okay,
the
let's go back to.
Okay, we did that pretty quick, I guess. The critical forecast for us right now is when will I finish? So there might be a possibility of a break. So I'm at least aware of it, and we'll do our best. Presenting a paper for a lot of us. If any of you are interested in process questions of how does something like this get done, it's still a story unfolding. We can pick that up in the discussion section. I'm looking for my return button. Mouse to the rescue. see those other species are helpful. A fair number of the concerns about TF, tech forecasting, and TA, technology assessment, have been covered, and I will bounce pretty quickly. For those of you not into our jargon, TA is technology assessment, meaning really what are the likely effects of this changing technology. It's not trying to evaluate, should I buy the new soybean planter or the old one. It's what will happen differently if I go to this advanced system. Okay? A term that's emerged with some fair bit of notoriety this past decade is technology foresight. We've seen a number of national foresight studies that key on technology. You can pretty well look, if you exclude North America, where we still are into this anti-planning mode, a lot of countries picking up on issues of where best to put their resources. Within the corporate environment, also somewhat in government, you see road mapping, trying to map ahead. Interesting imagery there, with quite a bit of activity. Another arena of looking at technology, competitive technological intelligence. And this is intelligence not where it was during the Cold War, limited to government. Now it's industrial intelligence. Incidentally, usually above board, going for open sources. It's not corporate spying so much. Okay, anyway, our paper got going. We're trying to look at where this arena of technology forecasting and assessment should be going. Here's some patterns of where it's been going in terms of activity. And you can see the trend there. Whether you look at methodological articles or total articles and so on, has been steeply down. Now, part of that is a change in jargon and terminology, but there's also, this has not been a growing field. Okay. This is probably coming about an hour late for our session, but why should those of you not into technology be concerned about technology? The assertion would be it's the key to competitiveness these days, and that's competitiveness both nationally and corporate competitiveness. It's the underlying driver in our society. So those of you interested in systems of which we're a part, this is a critical variable. Management of technology, therefore, becomes of interest. What can you do about that? There's a real issue here in not just generating information, but putting it to use. We've had some undertones of that already. I think that's a real challenge to the systems community. In my perspective, we are a group have been absolutely abysmal at getting anybody to care about listening to us. We enjoy talking to ourselves. Tech forecasters less so, but some problems in that arena. There have been a number of new forms that have come forth in the 90s, but we're really interested in looking ahead. Some of the issues here are, what's the difference? What are the tools that work in these different variations on technology, foresight, pick your terminology that you like, and what new tools should come? Okay? I'm in fact going to not say very much about the new tools, which is a chunk of our paper, but not the essence of it. Joe and Hal have talked about those already. If you extrapolate what Don said into tools to talk about complex technologies, you've got some other directions to pursue. But a couple of observations on what's changing from that heyday back in the Cold War era, where tech forecasting was driven primarily by military systems need to know. One difference is the nature of the technologies. We've gone from primarily industrial technologies, kind of slower moving with a military slant, to a number of faster moving and radically different technologies. We're in the information age right probably just getting into it right now if you talk about it in terms of putting information to new uses. Yeah, we've been fiddling around with computers for 40 years, but only recently are we starting to get much payback from it. Biotech, meaning genetically engineered stuff, is coming into fashion. Nanotechnology is one of the things a little ways out, the molecular engineering, if you will. How do you forecast those sorts of technologies? Not the same way you did large military industrial systems. One little benchmark there is looking at the number of industries whose patents derive primarily from science as opposed to from technology. And this is based on looking at what they cite in their patent applications. And a forecast looking at the pattern there is the number of major industries is going up radically. So again, for those of you with a technology forecasting interest, it says we need to really try to do some science forecasting. And that's tougher. Okay, I've already mentioned, at least indirectly, that the driver is shifting from the government and military interest to the commercial. The notion of innovation forecasting, I think, fits very well with what Don Kash just spoke about. If you're dealing with complex technological systems, you're not going to be very successful at forecasting them if you look very narrowly at technical parameters. And we're now trying to implement that little bit of common sense / wisdom. And how do you do it? Okay. Our guess, and we don't have strong documentation here of a prevailing trend, is that the interest in the effects of technology is on the ascendancy again. Now, those of you in the U.S., how many of you are familiar with the Office of Technology Assessment? I guess half the group. Well, since Joe used to work there, this was an agency created 1972 domain by and for the U.S. Congress to provide some information on some of these important technology systems about which so much public policy is made with so little knowledge. Well, in our renewal of insights in 1995, our Gingrich-led Congress got rid of this unneeded insight. So we've done away with it, leaving the rest of the highly developed world kind of baffled by our interest there. Technology assessment is alive and well in Europe, incidentally. But is there sufficient demand for people to do these studies to tell you in advance what the likely effects might be? Okay, methods, and I'm going to bounce over these. One I might comment on, just this heading up there, trying to categorize one set of the new methods, tries to exploit the coming availability of information in particularly electronic forms. And for whatever your own interest, you might see, are you tapping the information you could in the internet and these very substantial electronic databases that are often publicly available, sometimes for a fee. There's a whole new another setup here, trying to deal with the complexity. We've said we care about innovation, not just technical change in a narrow sense. Here's a set of some of the tools, and I think most all of these have already been mentioned. I'll bounce ahead. A few issues. One is who are the customers for these studies? I've already taken a shot at system science at saying that we don't do a very good job of caring about who our customers are, if there could be any customers. Well, in the forecasting arena, one of the senses is that there's a change here, too. In the past, the customers have been these extremely large organizations, government agencies or multinational corporations. How about the small organizations with a lot at stake? How about involving the consumers of these technologies? The sense is there's more role for that these days as we have some quick changing technologies, some marketing folks interested in what would-be consumers would like. So again, how do we adapt forecasting to engage them? What are the training requirements? Are there any? Again, I think forecasting shares with the systems domain of the simple answer here, no. Anybody can proclaim themselves a forecaster or a systems person. There may be some things to do in this arena that not only would provide some credentials, but also would help in nurturing the field, I think. Development support for these tools. Once upon a time in the technology assessment arena particularly, there was a National Science Foundation program to further this, incidentally headed by Joe Coates. That was a very small program, but it generated academic interest. Academic interest generates students studying it. Students studying it go out and try to apply some of those tools. So you take away a little bit of support upstream, and you lose quite a bit. And I've made it through to the end. Okay. We went a little bit briefly through this, and I think you all know that if anybody wants to pursue any of our issues, we have the discussion section in A60. Okay. Peter.
I, for one, was extremely stimulated by the four speakers that we've had, and I have a lot of questions, and also I really want to hear more from in a couple of cases where we had to cut the talks short. So I would like you would like to remind you that there will be a discussion panel involving these four speakers from this symposium immediately following the break. A couple of other things. There will also be a special panel here in this room on capitalism in the 21st century, the challenge of sustainability. That's in your program, but it's back here in the plenary room, not in one of our other panel rooms. I also want to just remind you again, since I may not see some of you after the break, that we have these dinner hour video interviews scheduled in Pittman Hall, and the idea is for you to pick up your dinner if you would like to attend these, and then you can take it. I assume they will provide you with an appropriate container over to Pittman Hall so that you can have your dinner there while you're watching the videos. And then the only other announcement is that we had tentatively scheduled dinner hour discussions around the tables in the cafeteria with the speakers as we did at noontime. Since we're going to have the follow-up discussion panel with the speakers on this symposium, the feeling was that maybe we didn't need to do anything at dinner as well. So we'll collapse those two into the event that just follows the break. And also the capitalism panel, which will be back here, is a 2-hour session, so the feeling is that there will be ample opportunity for discussion there. So we will not this evening, after all, have those dinners with the speakers as we had planned, but we will be doing that tomorrow night instead. So now we can take a break, and the panel sessions start at 10 minutes to 4, 15:50 hours.